Goodbye Mr. Chips, by James Hilton. James Hilton was born in 1900. He was a schoolmaster's son. He was the pupil of the LEYS School, Cambridge. He was a novelist and journalist. He wrote some well-known novel. He started writing in boyhood when an article by him was published in the Manchester Guradian. His novel Katherine herself was published when he was an undergraduate. His some well-known novels are Katherine herself, and Now Goodby, Night Without Armour, Lost Horizon, Random Harnest, Time and Time Again and Goodbye Mr. Chips. He died in 1954. Goodbye Mr. Chips was James Hilton's famous novel. He wrote this just in 4 days in 1934. It is divided into 18 chapters. It is a biographical novel. It deals with the life of Mr. Chips. The details are beautifully woven into the structure of the novel. It is believed that Goodbye Mr. Chips have been based on the LEYS School, Cambridge, where James Hilton was a pupil during 1915 to 1918. The inspiration of the character Mr. Chips came from many sources. We may relate his character to Hilton's father, who was the headmaster of Chapel End School. However, his character is also related to W.H. Balarinie, one of the masters at the LEYS School 1900 to 1930 who was in charge of the LEYS. He had been linked with the school for 51 years and spent his last years. When you are getting on in years but not ill, of course, you get very sleepy at times, and the hours seem to pass like lazy cattle moving across a landscape. It was like that for Chips as the autumn term progressed and the days shortened till it was actually dark enough to light the gas before Calover. For Chips, like some old sea captain, still measured time by the signals of the past, and well he might, for he lived at Mrs. Wikus, just across the road from the school. He had been there more than a decade, ever since he finally gave up his mastership, and it was Brookfield far more than Greenwich time that both he and his landlady kept. Mrs. Wicket, Chips would sing out, in that jerky, high-pitched voice that had still a good deal of sprightliness in it. Miss Wicket, you might bring me a cup of tea before prep, will you?
Yes, of course, Mr. Chipping.
Chips could even remember Brookfield in Weatherby's time. A phenomenon, that was. Weatherby had been an old man in those days, 1870, easy to remember because of the Franco-Prussian War. Chips had put in for Brookfield after a year at Melbury, which he hadn't liked, because he had been ragged there a good deal. But Brookfield he had liked, almost from the beginning. He remembered that day of his preliminary interview, sunny June, with the air full of flower scents and the plick-plock of cricket on the pitch. Brookfield was playing Barnhurst, and one of the Barnhurst boys, a chubby little fellow, made a brilliant century. Queer that a thing like that should stay in the memory so clearly. Chips often thought, as he sat by the fire at Mrs. Wikus, I am probably the only man in the world who has a vivid recollection of old Weatherby. Vivid, yes, it was a frequent picture in his mind, that summer day with the sunlight filtering through the dust in Weatherby's study. You are a young man, Mr. Chipping, and Brookfield is an old foundation. Youth and age often combine well. Give your enthusiasm to Brookfield, and Brookfield will give you something in return. And don't let anyone play tricks with you.
Oh yes, headmaster.
Take up a firm attitude from the beginning, that's the secret of it.
Yes, of course, sir.
He remembered that first tremendous ordeal of taking prep, a September sunset more than half a century ago, big hall full of lusty barbarians ready to pounce on him as their legitimate prey. His youth, fresh-complexioned, high-collared, and side-whiskered, odd fashions people followed in those days, at the mercy of 500 unprincipled ruffians to whom the baiting of new masters was a fine art, an exciting sport, and something of a tradition. Decent little beggars individually, but, as a mob, just pitiless and implacable. The sudden hush as he took his place at the desk on the dais, the scowl he assumed to cover his inward nervousness, the tall clock ticking behind him, and the smells of ink and varnish, the last blood-red rays slanting in slabs through the stained glass windows.
Students. I am Mr. Chipping and I will teach you Latin and Greek. You there in the 5th row, you with the red hair. What's your name?
Collie, sir.
You dropped the desk lid. Very well, Collie, you have 100 lines to learn.
And years later, when Collie was an alderman of the City of London and a baronet and various other things, he sent his son, also red-haired, to Brookfield, and Chips would say, "Collie, your father was the first boy I ever punished when I came here 25 years ago." And again, years after that, many years after that, there was an even better joke. For another Collie had just arrived, son of the Collie who was a son of the first Collie. And Chips would say, "Collie, your grandfather was a stupid fellow, your grandfather wasn't much better, either. And, my dear Collie, you are the biggest fool of their lot." There came to him, stirred by the warmth of the fire and the gentle aroma of tea, 1,000 tangled recollections of old times. Spring, the spring of 1896. He was 48, an age at which a permanence of habits begins to be predictable. He had just been appointed housemaster. With this and his classical forms, he had made for himself a warm and busy corner of life. During the summer vacation he went up to the Lake District with Ralston, a colleague. They walked and climbed for a week, until Ralston had to leave suddenly on some family business. Chips stayed on alone at Wasdale Head, where he boarded in a small farmhouse. One day, climbing on Great Gable.
"Hello? Hello? Hello?"
Oh my God, hey lady. Don't move, I am coming.
Oh, gentlemen. Are you hurt? I mean your ankle. Are you?
Oh. No, not very much.
Oh no, I was just calling my friends on the mountain.
And I thought you were in trouble.
Oh, by the way, what's your name?
Oh, my name is Mr. Chipping.
And I am Katherine Bridges.
Well, nice name.
Thanks. I think you cannot walk. Okay, give your hand, we will help you to reach your residence.
Katherine Bridges was 25, young enough to be Chips's daughter. She had blue, flashing eyes and freckled cheeks and smooth straw-colored hair. She too was staying at a farm, on holiday with a girlfriend, and as she considered herself responsible for Chips's accident, she used to bicycle along the side of the lake to the house in which the quiet, middle-aged, serious-looking man lay resting. That was how she thought of him at first. And he, because she rode a bicycle and was unafraid to visit a man alone in a farmhouse sitting room, wondered vaguely what the world was coming to. His sprain put him at her mercy, and it was soon revealed to him how much he might need that mercy. She was a governess out of a job, with a little money saved up. She read and admired Ibsen. She believed that women ought to be admitted to the universities. She even thought they ought to have a vote. In politics she was a radical, with leanings toward the views of people like Bernard Shaw and William Morris.
Well, what do you do, Mr. Chipping?
I am just a schoolmaster.
Oh, Chips, I'm so glad you are what you are. I was afraid you were a solicitor or a stockbroker or a dentist or a man with a big cotton business in Manchester. When I first met you, I mean, schoolmastering's so different, so important, don't you think?
I hadn't thought of it like that, or, at least, not often. I will do my best, that does all anyone can do in any job.
Yes, of course. Chipping. I want to live with you in my whole life, if you don't mind.
But Katherine, I have only a mediocre degree, difficulties of discipline, so I will never get a promotion, and I am completely ineligible to marry a young and ambitious girl. She liked him, initially, because he was so hard to get to know, because he had gentle and quiet manners, because his opinions dated from those utterly impossible 70s and 80s and even earlier, yet were, for all that, so thoroughly honest, and because his eyes were brown and he looked charming when he smiled.
Shall I call you sir, or would Mr. Chips be the right thing?
I would like you to call me only Chips.
Then goodbye, Mr. Chips.
Within a week they were head over heels in love. Before Chips could walk without a stick, they considered themselves engaged, and they were married in London a week before the beginning of the autumn term.
Dear Chips, you are a new Chips now. Your discipline is very improved and your lectures are very interesting now.
No doubt, Katherine. It's all due to your love.
Chips, you know what I want. A team from the mission should come up to Brookfield and play one of the school's 11s at soccer.
The idea is so revolutionary that from anyone but Katherine no one will agree to introduce a group of slum boys to the serene pleasances of better-class youngsters.
Chips, they're wrong, you know, and I'm right. I'm looking ahead to the future, they and you are looking back to the past. England isn't always going to be divided into officers and other ranks. And those popular boys are just as important to England as Brookfield is.
Oh dear, Katherine, it's a wonderful idea. I will definitely discuss this to the principal. Rather to her surprise, he gave way and suddenly became a keen advocate of the proposal, and the volte-face was so complete that the authorities were taken unawares and found themselves consenting to the dangerous experiment. The boys from Poplar arrived at Brookfield one Saturday afternoon, played soccer with the school's second team, were honorably defeated by 7-5, and later had high tea with the school team in the dining hall. They then met the head and were shown over the school, and Chips saw them off at the railway station in the evening. They took back with them also the memory of a charming woman who had met them and talked to them very well. It was 1st April 1898, a tragic day in Chips' life. Katherine with her newly born baby died in the same day. He lost interest in the school affairs. Young Faulkner met him in the lane to have the afternoon off. Chips said that he could go to Blazes. When he reached school, did not talk to anyone. He was at his desk. Someone said,
"Sir, there are letters for you."
He opened them one by one, but all the letters contained a blank sheet of paper. Many days later, Chips realized that it was a piece of April foolery. After the Katherine's death, Chips was badly shaken. His hair turned grey. He said, "My wife is dead and my child is dead, and I wish I were dead myself." Ralston was appointed the headmaster of the Brookfield after the death of Meldrum. He was a science graduate. He wanted to run the school on modern lines. He was efficient, ambitious but unkind and revengeful as well. "I am Ralston and I am your new headmaster. You have to follow my rules."
Chips, your method of teaching is slack and old-fashioned. Your personal habits are slovenly and you ignore my instructions, I noticed. Your pronunciation is outdated. Chips, you should retire now.
"No, headmaster. I do not want to retire, and I don't need to consider it." When Ralston and Chips were quarreling, a small boy heard all this. He told the other boys about it. The boys wrote letters to their parents. The news spread in the town like a wildfire. One day the chairman of the governors, Sir John Rivers, visited Brookfield, ignored Ralston, and went direct to Chips. Mr. Chips told him all the story. And then in 1908 Rivers visited again and said,
"Chips, old boy, I hear you've been having the deuce of a row with Ralston. Sorry to hear about it, for your sake, but I want you to know that the governors are with you to a man. We don't like the fellow a great deal. Very clever and all that, but a bit too clever, if you ask me. Claims to have doubled the school's endowment funds by some monkeying on the stock exchange. Dare say he has, but a chap like that wants watching. So if he starts chucking his weight about with you, tell him very politely he can go to the devil. The governors don't want you to resign. Brookfield wouldn't be the same without you, and they know it. We all know it. You can stay here till you're 100 if you feel like it. Indeed, it's our hope that you will.
So he stayed on at Brookfield, having as little to do with Ralston as possible. And in 1911 Ralston left, to better himself. He was offered the headship of one of the greater public schools. His successor was a man named Chatteris, whom Chips liked. He was even younger than Ralston had been, 34. He was supposed to be very brilliant, at any rate. He was modern, natural sciences tripos, friendly, and sympathetic. Recognizing in Chips a Brookfield institution, he courteously and wisely accepted the situation. In 1913 Chips had had bronchitis and was off duty for nearly the whole of the winter term. It was that which made him decide to resign that summer, when he was 65. At that final end-of-term dinner, in July 1913, Chips received his farewell presentations and made a speech. It was not a very long speech, but it had a good many jokes in it, and was made twice as long, perhaps, by the laughter that impeded its progress. There were several Latin quotations in it. Remember lots of changes at Brookfield. I remember the first bicycle. I remember when there was no gas or electric light and we used to have a member of the domestic staff called a lamp boy. He did nothing else but clean and trim and light lamps throughout the school. I remember when there was a hard frost that lasted for 7 weeks in the winter term. There were no games, and the whole school learned to skate on the fens. 1880-something, that was. I remember when 2/3 of the school went down with German measles and Big Hall was turned into a hospital ward. I remember the great bonfire we had on Mafeking night. It was lit too near the pavilion and we had to send for the fire brigade to put it out. And the firemen were having their own celebrations and most of them were in a regrettable condition. At the end of ceremony, Chips received his farewell presentations of a cheque and a writing desk and a wall clock. In July 1914, the First World War extended much. Chips expected that it would end by Christmas. But he was greatly shocked when the war entered the next year. During the war in 1915, military camps were set up near Brookfield. In July 1916, Chatteris met Mr. Chips and told him about his illness and overworked. He invited Mr. Chips to rejoin Brookfield to help him. Chips felt very happy because he felt himself necessary to Brookfield. In the winter of 1917, Chatteris died. The authorities asked Chips to take Chatteris' place as acting head. Chips gladly agreed to work. One day, during shelling, 5 bombs had fallen in and around Brookfield. 9 persons had been killed. The World War I ended on November 11, 1918. A holiday was declared. The kitchen staff was asked to provide a large meal. When school reassembled after the holidays, he was back at Mrs. Wikus. At his own request there were no more farewells or presentations, nothing but a handshake with his successor and the word acting crossed out on official stationery. The duration was over.
Mrs. Wicket, my dear fellow Chips is fitter than I am. He has no horrible disease. But look after him, you know. His chest, it puts a strain on his heart. Nothing really wrong with him, only Anno Domini, but that's the most fatal complaint of all, in the end.
It was November afternoon, a cold and foggy. Chips, 85 years old, did not go out. A little boy, Linford, came to see Mr. Chips. He said,
Does Mr. Chips live here?
You'd better come inside. I am the person you want. Now what can I do for you?
I was told you wanted me, sir.
Quite right, my boy. I wanted you to take tea with me. Will you sit down by the fire? I don't think I have seen your face before. How is that?
I've only just come out of the sanatorium, sir. I've been there since the beginning of term with measles.
Ah, that accounts for it. Chips had realized that some boys had sent him by way of joke. He entertained him with tea and walnut cake. He encouraged the boy and shared with him his memories of Brookfield. You're growing up into a very cross sort of world, Linford. Maybe it will have got over some of its crossness by the time you are ready for it. Let's hope so at any rate. Well, I'm sorry, you can't stay. Goodbye, my boy.
Goodbye, Mr. Chips.
Chips sat by the fire again, with those words echoing along the corridors of his mind. Goodbye, Mr. Chips, an old leg pull, to make new boys think that his name was really Chips. The joke was almost traditional. He did not mind. Goodbye, Mr. Chips. He remembered that on the eve of his wedding day Kathy had used that same phrase, mocking him gently for the seriousness he had had in those days. He thought, nobody would call me serious today, that's very certain. Suddenly the tears began to roll down his cheeks. An old man's failing, silly, perhaps, but he couldn't help it. He felt very tired, talking to Linford like that had quite exhausted him. But he was glad he had met Linford. Nice boy. Would do well. He was too tired. After a short while he fainted.
Poor old chap, must have lived a lonely sort of life, all by himself. Pity. Pity he never had any children.
What was that you were saying about me just now?
Nothing, Chips.
I thought I heard you, one of you saying it was a pity I never had any children. But I have, thousands of them, and all boys. He seemed so peaceful that they did not disturb him to say good night, but in the morning, as the school bell sounded for breakfast, Brookfield had the news Chips died in 1933.